For all the latest on the SaWGuy podcast, be sure to subscribe and don't forget that bell icon. Welcome to the SaWGuy podcast. As always, y'all know, I am the demon of SaWGuy. And as the demon of SaWGuy, I present to you episode 58, Secret Window. Such an amazing, underrated classic from Stephen King. And without further ado, let's get this shit started.
Hello, and welcome to the SaWGuy podcast.
My reign of terror was legendary.
I stutter, bitch.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
You opened it. We came.
Oh, yes. There will be blood.
That's one of those Stephen King films that usually gets overlooked. It's underrated, and that's one of my favorites. Anytime I talk to anybody about Secret Window, everyone's like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm like, the Stephen King classic, the one that came out in 2004, Johnny Depp, and then all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. Oh, okay, now I remember. And with Secret Window, I've always loved the story. I read the book, and I've seen the movie about a dozen times. And I could say, I relate to that story very much, with the character of Mort Rainey and what it's like to be isolated and, deal with your own thoughts and your own inner demons. And with that being said, with this film, it was released back in 2004, and it was around the hype of the Pirates of the Caribbean when it came out. When Pirates of the Caribbean came out, everybody was all about Johnny Depp. And, he kind of had a career resurgence with it. And when he did this film, they were really hard on the rating, because it was released from Sony Pictures and Columbia TriStar. And what they wanted to do is that they wanted to keep it around PG-13, and they kind of pushed the envelope. I mean, it's a horror film, so you have to push the envelope with it. And with that being said, the whole story was really good with it. It was very much in tune with the book. There's subtle differences anytime you go from a book to a movie and a movie to a book. You have that all the time. But with this, it really kept true to the whole root of the story. And interestingly enough, this is actually not supposed to be made into a film because Stephen King, he owned the rights to this. But he traded his rights for this film to get Kingdom Hospital. And, he did Kingdom Hospital as like the miniseries TV show and stuff like that. And, how crazy is that? When I first heard of Secret Window when it was released, and when I went to go see it, there was very little mention that it was Stephen King's story. And, you had to really kind of be a fan of Stephen King to understand, like, oh shit, this is actually based off one of his books. And the book that it's based off of, it's off of 4 Past Midnight. That's the Stephen King book that it's based off of. And when you go from the book to the movie, you're going to have subtle differences. You had director David Koepp, and originally he was the writer of like big films like Jurassic Park and stuff like that. He decided that he was going to write the movie version of this, the screenplay, and direct the film. And the way how he did it, I just loved how he emphasized so many different things. And he included a lot of stuff that wasn't in the book. And as I do in every episode, I'm going to break down the movie for you and throw in all the little tidbits and pointers because this is an interesting film. It really is, And if you haven't checked out Secret Window, go check it out. But anyway, Secret Window starts off, you see the whole Columbia TriStar and everything. You see the movie logo. And then it starts off with Johnny Depp just sitting there, just like, staring at the camera really hard. And what I thought about it was like, damn, okay, this is a weird kind of beginning how they started this film. And, then he starts kind of, talking to himself, and you hear his thoughts where he says, turn around. And then I guess it's snowing or raining, and you find out in a sec that it's actually snowing. And he's at a spot somewhere, and he's just sitting in his car, he's cleaning off his glasses, and he's telling himself, you got to get the fuck out of here, do it right now. And what does he do? He shifts the car in reverse, burns out, and then all of a sudden he's like, you know what, screw it. And then he goes back, and what I like about it shows that he's in the snow, he drives back super fast, and he goes into this hotel. I guess it's the main lobby or whatever. It's one of those mom and pop ones. He goes in there, he grabs the key, and then you see the manager there like, hey, what the hell are you doing? He jumps in his car because he has one of those old school Jeep Cherokees. He jumps in the car, starts it, pulls up super fast, and he stops at this door. And what I love about this is that the director, David Koepp, he's a huge fan of Stephen King, so he had a lot of Stephen King winks in there. You know, the red door was supposed to be a wink of like The Shining and stuff. And so anyways, Johnny Depp gets in there, and it's old school key. He pops in the key, opens the door, and he sees that there's this chick laying in bed with this dude. And, you know, he goes in there and he starts screaming, "Ah!" Turns around, and then the hotel manager comes in, and then now you have the movie credits starting, and it's like, whoa, what the fuck just happened? You know, I mean, it's implied obviously something happened, and then it shows like the whole title sequence and everything. What I thought was pretty cool is it shows, you know, this outdoor nature area, and it shows like this cabin where it goes in through the window, the secret window. And, you know, it follows through and it shows this mirror, and it falls into Johnny Depp. And then, you know, he plays a character named Mort Rainey. And, you know, you find out that happened 6 months earlier, because then it says 6 months later. And it shows Johnny Depp where he's laying on the couch asleep. And half of this movie is just Johnny Depp trying to sleep. But, I mean, there's a reason to it, right? It shows that he's asleep, and then he gets this pounding on the door. And we all had that, you know, where we're trying to sleep on the bed, or if we're trying to sleep on the couch and someone's like shaking the shit out of the door. He wakes up and he, you know, opens the door, and it's this guy who's dressed up like a farmer. And, you know, his name's John Shooter. He's played by John Turturro. And the first thing he says when he opens the door, he says, "You stole my story." And he's like, "The hell are you talking about? I don't even know you." He goes, "I understand that, but you stole my story." And then, you know, he's trying to tell him, "Well, if you have any issues with it, you can take it up to my agent." And he's like, "No, this is between you and me, and you stole my story. Read it." And he's like, "I'm not gonna read it. You know, you need to get the fuck out of here." So he closes the door, and, you know, he leaves. And what does Johnny Depp do? He goes back to take a nap right on his couch, you know? Then it shows his daily life. You know, obviously he does take a lot of naps, and it shows, you know, it implies the fact that he's a writer, so he's writing a news story. He gets up and he's working on the computer and everything, and he's talking to his dog, and he's like, "Well, I'm open to suggestions," you know? It's kind of like crazy to think about it, because it shows that he's all alone, isolated in this cabin in the woods. And as he's trying to write and everything like that, it shows that his cleaning lady, you know, Mrs. Garvey, she's there, and she's cleaning up everything. And, you know, he's trying to, you know, get ideas to write. And then he's, you know, talking to himself, and you hear the dialogue where he's like, "I don't know about this. This is bad writing. This is all bad writing. So no more bad writing." He deletes it, and he's just sitting there all proud, staring at his dog. Eventually, you know, he goes downstairs. He has to go and get the favorite drink of mine, the bubbly. I'm talking about Mountain Dew, of course, right? And as he gets his Mountain Dew, you know, he sees that the story's, you know, taken out of the trash, and it's left on the table, and then he's looking at it like, what the fuck is this, you know? And he sees like the whole premise of the whole story. And, you know, Mrs. Garvey says, "Oh, I saw that it was in the trash. I thought it was yours, so I pulled it out." And he goes, "Yeah, I see that," you know. And he's not too fond of her, so he looks at her and he does the finger gun, you know, right behind her back and everything, just like, you know. You know, he had kind of like a dark humor sense to him. And so he starts reading the story. And the story that he has is called Sowing Season, which I thought was pretty cool. It's a wink to, you know, the book. In the book, John Shooter's story was called Secret Window. In the movie, his story was called Sowing Season. He starts reading the first few lines of it, and then he starts to freak out like, "Oh shit," you know, because they're very similar to the story. And, you know, he knocks over his drink and everything. Mrs. Garvey comes, they start talking and everything. He's like, "I didn't write this." She goes, "Well, I thought you did, and thought you used one of them pseudonames." He's like, No, I never had to use one." And he's trying to tell her like, "Hey, I didn't write this." She goes, "Oh, okay, that's nice." You know, she just kind of blows him off. And so he starts freaking out, and so he's like, "Okay, whatever." He goes into his books, pulls out his book, and he's flipping through. He finds the book, and it has his story, Secret Window. And as he's going through and comparing the two, now he starts to flip out like, what the hell, they're very much alike. And then he starts to freak out. And instead of actually trying to do something, you know, he's sitting at his desk and he's digging through all of his drawers and everything, and then he pulls out a pack of cigarettes, and he had one cigarette left, and, you know, he puts it in his mouth. Before he lights it, his dog's looking at him, and he's like, "I didn't steal the story. I didn't." And as he starts lighting it, he didn't want Mrs. Garvey to know that he was smoking, so she comes up and she's like, "I'm all done, Mr. Rainey." He's like, "Okay." You know, and then eventually they have a little bit of dialogue, because now it's implied with her saying, you know, some women, they don't know what they have in front of them. It was implied that he was married and had a wife, but in the beginning, it showed that, you know, he caught her cheating on him. And as he's reading the story and talking to Miss Garvey, he's thinking about, you know, how their time was together, where they had this little window on the side of their cabin that they lived. You know, she moves shit around, and then he sees that she's sitting there and she's talking like, "Oh, here's a secret window. Oh, that's where I'm going to put my garden." It's a secret window for a secret garden, you know? And there's a lot of flashbacks. You know, with that being said, Mort Rainey, he's a character who suffered through a lot. Obviously, you know, he lost his wife because she was, you know, cheating on him and stuff like that. He was very isolated because, you know, writers, they tend to be isolated and they need their own time to think and to write and be creative. And, you know, there's a lot of little things that kind of go on with Mort that makes you think, okay, well, he's lived through, you know, a lot of shit. Then it shows after she leaves, you know, he starts getting all nitpicky where he's like, Mr. Garvey gotta go and get on my business. Get your sticky fingers out of my pillows, you know? Because he had all his fucking pillows lined up right there on his couch. Throws them down, and what does he do? He fucking goes back to sleep. It shows that as he's sleeping, he's dreaming. And as he starts to dream, his phone rings. And, you know, he gets up, he picks up the phone and everything. Ends up being his ex-wife who's calling. And, you know, if you had that situation where you get a phone call from your ex and everything, you know, you'd kind of dread it. And that's what he did. He picked up the phone, he's like, yeah. And, you know, she was just basically like, hey, you okay? You know, I had this bad feeling. He's like, I'm fine. Why the hell did you call? Well, I get those weird feelings all the time, and I wanted to make sure you're good because, you know, you're up there in the middle of nowhere. And he goes, I'm fine. If anything happens, I'll let you know. And then they start talking about the other dude that's involved. And Mort, he was just basically saying, well, you know, hey, we share the same interest, been to the same place. You know, I should invite him out for a drink. And, you know, they started going back and forth and everything. And then eventually, you know, he had to make the asshole comment where he's like, oh, well, you should have him move into the house. I mean, I love that house. I loved it so much. That's the reason why I bought it. And, you know, they both hanged up on each other. And he still, it's implied that he still loves her. And he's trying to make things work. But obviously, it's not going to work because she's already moved on. Then eventually, he gets up and he goes out for a hike. And, you know, he's walking through this trail and everything in the forest. And as he walks up, this is where he sees John Shooter. And he starts talking to him. And John Shooter basically tells him, oh, recognize it? Must have rang a bell, didn't it? And Mort pretty much said, oh, yeah, you know, it definitely rang the bell. And then he goes, when'd you write it? And John Shooter was like, well, how'd you steal my story in a little shit town of Mississippi? And he's like, well, when did you write it? And he goes, well, why does it matter? And he goes, well, shit, that's the whole point of everything, right? You know, when two writers show up with the same story, it's all about who did it first. And, you know, he's talking about how he wrote his in 1997. And Mort is like, drop it. And he's like, drop it? He's like, if anyone's going to bitch about plagiarism, it should be me. Because I wrote my story in 1994 and it was published for the first time in Ellery Queen magazine, 1995. And they start bickering, where he's like, no, you lie. And then he's like, no, I don't. You know, they kind of had this shoving match. And then he's telling him, like, look it up yourself. And he goes, well, how the hell am I supposed to do that? He goes, that's not my problem. And he tells him, go ahead and go look for it for yourself. And he goes, well, how the hell am I supposed to do that? Am I supposed to drive to Riverdale at your house with your beautiful wife, Amy, and ask her for it? And he basically told him, where he's like, I read it off your book jacket. And he's like, well, that's not my house anymore. And he's like, the hell does it mean it's not your house? He goes, what does it mean, you ignorant hick? I'm going through a divorce. D-I-V-O-R-C-E, divorce. And so he tells him, he goes, okay, well, I'm going to give you 3 days to get that book from your ex. In 3 days, I'll come back. And, you know, he just kind of blows him off, and he's like, yeah, it's always nice to meet a reader. And it shows that he's back at his house. He makes a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and fucking Doritos. But he doesn't eat it. You know, I mean, after everything that he's been through, I mean, I can understand why he doesn't eat it, right? And so he's just sitting there, and then he's like, staring at the phone. He's like, I don't want to call her. And then he's telling his dog, I want to go to sleep. I want to take a nap. And he's trying to, you know, cuddle with his dog, and his dog just kind of runs out, and he's like, whatever, you blind bastard. So he goes down and lays on his couch, and he knocks out again, right? He has this dream where he ends up, like, being on the edge of a cliff, then he falls over, like, into the ocean, then he wakes up, like, whoa, what the hell? And it's already dark. He gets up, and he tries to turn on the lights, and all the lights are all busted, so he gets a flashlight, goes around, and then he sees this note that says 3 days, I'm not joking. And it shows a fucking screwdriver through his dog. I was like, oh shit. So he's all pissed off. Shooter, you son of a bitch. I'll get you for this. So he starts locking up the house and everything, and then he buries his dog. And you know what any normal person would do, they went to the sheriff. So he goes to the sheriff, and the sheriff in the town that he's at, Thashmore, basically, you know, it's a really small town, like probably 50 people. There's mom and pop businesses and shit. And he's telling the sheriff, like, hey, this guy killed my dog. And the sheriff was like, oh, yeah, you know, just blowing him off. And, you know, he's like doing needlepoint and everything. And then he's like, well, you know, he killed my dog. And he's like, well, that's not actually a law here. He's like, what the hell are you talking about? What about invasion of privacy and all this? He's like, yeah. Well, let me get a description. Which I thought was fucking funny because here this whole time he's giving him all the description, trying to get him to like, hey, get off your ass, help me out here. He didn't do anything. And, they basically, where this whole thing is taking place is in New York. So it's out in the country where he lives. So he goes to the city, and he goes to the city to go see his lawyer. And he's telling his lawyer the story, and his lawyer's like, well, did you steal it? He's like, what? No! What? He goes, kind of a coincidence that both of you guys had the same story. And then he tells him, hey, do you want to pick a side before, you start kind of helping me out here? And he's like, oh, I am on your side, but I need to know how crazy this guy is.
Is he a regular wacko like you've had before, in which case I can help? Or is this something you should be talking to your lawyer?
His lawyer's name is Ken Kirsch, who's played by Charles Dutton. And Charles Dutton, he's funny. I personally liked him when he was in Alien 3. He's a pretty well-known actor, for the role that he kind of came in with this. But he played the lawyer, and he was like the big, tough lawyer where he was like, okay, I'll handle this, And he starts telling him the stories about everything, what happened between him and Shooter. Then they get to the situation with his ex-wife. And then, it explains the story more about what happened. And, he's like, oh, I was just going to drive to Amy's house, pick it up. He's like, Amy's house? He's like, yeah, we split up about 6 months ago. And he's like, really? He goes, what was it like between you guys? He's like, no. What happened? Did you nail one of your groupies over there right behind the Barnes & Noble book signing? It's kind of funny that he threw in some humor in there. More, he just stops his clock because there was this little clock. If you've ever been to a lawyer's office, they have a clock where it ticks like how much time you spend with them and shit like that. So he clicks it off and then he's like, sorry, I apologize. It's a rotten profession. Clicks it back on as you were saying. And he's like, well, if this guy is, all he wants to see is a story. I'll just get the story, show it to him, but I want you to be there. And he goes, no shit, I'm going to be there with you. And he goes, you remember my rate? He's like, yeah, an obscene fortune. And, he got all the information. Then he was like, all right, whatever. And so what he was going to do, it shows that he's back in his Jeep and he starts driving up there. And it shows his house, right there on the side, but the other guy's car is there. The other guy's name was Ted. And, he sees that his car's there and he's like, oh shit. And he sees both of them come out of the house, so he parks across the street to stare. And, he's at that point, if you've ever been in a situation where, your partner or when anybody had cheating on you, it's one of those things that you look at and you're just like, oh, it sucks. It really does. And so he's sitting across the street looking in his rearview mirror and he's saying to himself, this isn't my house. This isn't my beautiful wife. Not anymore. And as that happens, he's like, all right, whatever. So he was going to go up there and get the magazine, but never did. And, he drives home and everything like that. He sees a black Cadillac. It ends up being his lawyer. And he's tipped over, over his car. And he's like, what the fuck? So he thinks John Shooter did something. So, he turns off his lights, goes up to the window, and then he wakes up and scares the shit out of him. And then eventually he's like, hey, are you going to stay tonight? He's like, no, not unless you want me to. And he's like, well, I just need help because it's pretty dark in there. He has his lawyer going through his house to check his shit. And so it shows the scene where his lawyer's going up and down the stairs looking around. He's like, no more monsters here. You check under my bed?
Check under my
bed.
even
your toy chest. And it shows that Johnny Depp's character, Mort, he's not really a fighter. He just keeps to himself, so he doesn't know what to do in this situation. And so that's when his lawyer was telling him, he's like, okay, what the hell are you going to do with that sailor? Because he had a freaking, paddle from a boat and shit and oar. And he's like, hey, think about it, if there was anybody else that seen, you in that nutcase. But then it shows like different flashbacks where he saw this guy named Tom Greenleaf, who's one of the local neighbors in the town, and he honked at him when he saw him, right? So he's like, oh, Tom Greenleaf. And he's like, well, how do you get a hold of him? He's like, well, he's always at the country store, every day at 9 a.m. for breakfast. He goes, all right, I'll take a look at it. And, he ends up leaving. And then all of a sudden, Mort starts hearing noises. He goes upstairs, he starts hearing all these noises. He gets his fire poker as he goes up. And, he sees his shadow in the mirror. And what I thought was kind of crazy is that this whole film has like this Shining-esque Stephen King, handprints all over on it. Because you find out later on what that whole scene meant. And as he's going through, he sees this shadow in the mirror. And then he's like, I know it's you in there, Pilgrim. If you don't get out of there by 10, I'm gonna come in swinging. 1, 2, and then he runs in there and he hits the fucking mirror and shatters it. He's like, I broke my mirror. Then he hears another noise and he breaks the shower door and he goes, and I killed my shower door. And the whole time it was just a little rat. So he picks up the rat He goes downstairs. As he goes downstairs, he sees that one smoke that's still left. And, you know, he runs up the stairs and grabs that smoke. He goes, I don't even care. I'm going to smoke this, smoke the shit out of this, and go buy another pack, and I'm going to smoke the shit out of that too. So he lets the rat go, lights a cigarette, and then all of a sudden, you know, as he's lighting it and starting to smoke, then all of a sudden, you know, you hear John Shooter's voice. I thought you don't smoke. And he's like, oh, well, I picked it up from my house recently. Then he tells Mort, well, did you read my story? And he goes, oh, I very much did. You know, and they have the dialogue where he's like, I can't decide what's worse. A piece of shit like you stealing my story or you ruining the ending. And then he tells him the ending, what it is that he had originally. You know, I know I can do it, Todd Downey said, topping himself to another ear of comb from the steaming bowl. I'm sure that in time her death will be a mystery even to me. And, you know, he's just playing him on because, you know, he's standing right next to the shovel where he had buried his dog Chico. And as he gets closer to him, he grabs the shovel and tries to take a swing at him. John catches it and picks him up. He puts the shovel right over his neck and he starts telling him, you know, hey, I can do some damage. You know, how would you feel if I go over there and you see on the news that your wife, Amy, you know, went off second best in a chainsaw match? And, you know, he puts him down and everything. He goes, I won't stop until right gets put right. 3 days, Mr. Rainey. And, you know, it shows that he's not fucking around. And, you know, it's just, at the whole time, it shows, you know, eventually he goes in the house, locks up, and he's laying in bed. And he starts thinking about the ending. And then, you know, he's like, you know what? That really was a good ending. Then he's sitting on his couch, and he's eating Doritos and Mountain Dew, the breakfast of champions, right? And he's staring at the phone. And, you know, he has it unplugged because it's one of those old school phones, you know, where it has the handrail and everything. You got to pick it up and on the dial and all that. So he unplugs it. You know, everything in his cabin's old school. So all of a sudden he gets up, he goes and plugs it in, and then the phone starts ringing off the hook, and he's like, what the fuck? And so he's thinking it's John Shooter, so he picks it up and he's like, is that you, Pilgrim? And it ends up being his wife, and so she's like, Mort, yes, Amy, I can hear you. And she's like, so where the hell have you been? I've been trying to get a hold of you. He's like, I was asleep. And, you know, he was married to his wife for 10 years, so she's like, you know, so you unplugged the phone? How can I help you, Amy? And then she tells him, well, someone burned down her house. And he can't fucking hear. And, you know, I'm deaf, and I've been guilty of this. You know, when you're eating chips and shit and you're crunching really loud, you can't hear when you're on the phone. So he's like, what? And, you know, she screams that someone burned down our house. And then it shows that he goes to the scene where his house was burned down. And, you know, he starts seeing how all the fire department, they're cleaning up and everything. And then it shows flashbacks of him and his wife having a good time at that house. And, you know, it's kind of sad. You sympathize with him a lot because, you know, he's lost a lot. Then eventually it shows his wife with her new boyfriend. And, you know, they come up and she gives him a hug and, you know, she's like, I'm sorry about all this. And he's like, yeah, so am I. And then what I thought was the douchest thing is that the new boyfriend, he's like, me too. And, you know, he's kind of getting in the middle of everything. He's very annoying, I guess you could say with this. And eventually that's when the police call him up and then the fire chief tells him, oh, well, you know, this place was burned down just by some gasoline and some champagne bottles. And, you know, they start asking, well, okay, first question, any of you guys have enemies? And, you know, she goes, nope. And then Ted, the new boyfriend, you know, he's like, no, not a soul. And Mort obviously doesn't like him because, you know, he was the one that kind of came in and ruined their whole fucking marriage and stuff, and who wouldn't blame him? And that's when he's like, hey, does it bother you if I answer a few of these right now? And so he starts talking to the fire chief and the detective, and he's, you know, pulls him to the side and he's like, yeah, I got an enemy. Then it shows that they're back at this office back in New York in the city. And, you know, they're meeting with her lawyers and his lawyers, and they start saying, well, we understand that this is a situation. You guys are, I guess there was a separation. Then they talk about how they divorced and everything. It's all finalized and how he moved out, has gotten all his stuff. And they give him the list of stuff of like, hey, okay, you guys go through this list. As he's going through the list, he doesn't like that Ted's looking into it, and his wife starts pulling it over so he can look. And then he starts, you know, saying, well, this is our stuff. You know, do you intend to rubberneck? And, you know, he's like, okay, well, I'm just going to go outside and everything. And he gives her a kiss right in front of him. He's like, oh, hell, Ted, why don't you live and, you know,
heck,
too,
Ted, live a little
rubbernecker. You know, it's just being an ass. And, you know, if you've ever been in that situation, I'm pretty sure we've all done that. We can all relate to that. And then it shows how they have this awkward moment where they're going down the elevator. And then he starts talking to Amy and saying, hey, you didn't tell Ted about the enemy that I have, right? And she's like, no, why? And he's like, well, just want to make sure that it's only between you and the lawyers. Then Ted comes in with coffee. And then, you know, he tells him, he goes, I'm sorry that you had to leave. I know how much you enjoy all my stuff. And he's like, all right, let's take a walk outside. Let's talk. So Amy sits inside the courthouse and everything. They start walking out. Then he tells him, well, you're a fucking dick. And he's like, you feel better? And then they start bickering. Where he's like, hey, I'm sorry, man. I apologize to you. Marriages end and yours was gone, you know, but when I came in. He's like, oh, well, you must have been confused when she had her wedding ring on. And they start bickering. And then now, you know, he's starting to think that Ted's involved in some way. Because, you know, he's pushing him to the edge of the street. And then all of a sudden this bus passes by super fast. And then, you know, he's like, are we getting the message? He's like, yeah, but where are we from, Teddy? And then, you know, he's looking at him and he tells him, Tennessee, Morty, you know, like they're being dicks to each other. He's like, well, I was going to say somewhere else like in Mississippi. He's like, nope, a long way from there at a place called Shooter's Bay. And, you know, I thought it was kind of crazy that they actually implied shooter because now the story pushes into the fact maybe Teddy was involved in this in some way. It shows afterwards he's driving home and he comes up to his house and, you know, he's looking around for his lawyer, Kirsch, and he's all telling himself, you know, he's like, come on, Kirsch, $500 a day. I mean, where the hell are you? And then he's looking around in his house and then his phone goes off. He answers it. And, you know, when you get in the house, first thing you got to do is go take a piss. So he picks up the phone and then all of a sudden he hears that it's his lawyer. And he's like, you know, his lawyer's asked, well, where the hell have you been? He goes, oh, I could ask you the same thing. He goes, relax. He goes, I heard about everything, man. I'm sorry. And he's like, yeah, it sucks because, you know, the place burned down before I could get the magazine out, da-da-da-da-da. He's like, well, I know that there's the original copy from your agent, so they're going to send it to you. You should get it tomorrow by 3 o'clock. He's like, I knew that's the reason why I hired you. And they start discussing things like, okay, who the hell is this shooter guy? And then that's when Kirsch is like, yeah, I met up with your Tom Greenleaf. He's a weird one. And, you know, first I asked him if he was there. He goes, well, yeah, I was there. And then he kept changing his story. Somebody must have got to him. And, you know, Mort's like, no, I don't think so. He's like, bullshit. He goes, I think this is something deeper. I think this is something where, you know, he was a hitman. They were called on and, you know, things started going too far. Dead dogs, people's houses get burned down. And he goes, can you think of anybody? And so that's when he starts thinking that maybe it could have been Ted because of how he said Shooter's Bay earlier. So he starts telling Kirsch, well, maybe it's probably Ted. He goes, Ted? Who the hell's Ted? He goes, Ted, the Ted that Amy left me for. And he goes, well, how do you know it's him? Did you piss him off? Then it shows, you know, flashback scenes of how he walked in on them. And, you know, he's like, I might have. And so, well, I'm re-changing my plan, you know. We're going to go over there. Both of us are going to go and talk to Tom Greenleaf. And, you know, we'll see if we have evidence. If there's evidence, then we got a case and we can go and get this guy. And he's like, okay. And then he, it shows that, you know, he's at the hotel. He's loading up his gun. And he's like, so, you going to be ready? And he's like, you know, tomorrow, Bowie store, 9 a.m.? He goes, 9 a.m. sharp.
I'll see you there.
And bring your six-gun, Pilgrim. And, you know, he's looking at the phone like, huh. And throughout the whole movie, you don't think that he has a gun, you know, but later on you eventually find out that he did have a gun somewhere. But then it shows that it's, you know, late night, he's in bed, he goes to sleep, and then he wakes up and he's like, you know. Then later on it shows that he's, you know, waking up from the couch again. And then he looks at his watch and then he's like, oh shit, you know, because he fucking overslept. It was like 11 a.m. And, you know, he gets his clothes on, his jacket or whatever. He's looking for his keys, but can't find his keys. So he opens the door and then he sees that it's John Shooter's hat on the floor. And, you know, he goes and gets a bag and bags that shit up. And then he goes outside and he sees his car still running outside, you know, in front of his house. And so he looks around and then he turns it off, walks out, and then, you know, gets in his car again. And then he's looking around and he sees that there's all these cigarettes from Pall Mall. Pall Mall was the brand that he was smoking. And he, you know, he's thinking like to himself, crazy bastard. Starts up the car. He goes to Tashmore into town. He goes into the hardware store and he's trying to look for them. He asked one of the waitresses that was working. He's like, I overslept. Was there any guys looking for me? She's like, no. Well, they might have overslept too because I didn't see him. And then, you know, there's this young kid who's stocking up cigarettes and he's like, oh, would you like a pack? And he's like, I don't smoke. And he gives him a dirty look like, what the hell are you talking about? Then eventually, he just gives up and he's like, okay, maybe they did oversleep. And, this is at a time where cell phones were still pretty big. But in this film, they didn't use any cell phones, which I thought was pretty strange. But, given the time, 2004, they were around, but I mean, only certain people had cell phones, right? So he's driving back home. As he's driving home, he sees, he sees at the gas station that Ted's over there gassing up his car. And then all of a sudden he stops in the middle of the road, backs up, and then he goes up to Ted and he goes, what the hell are you doing here? He goes, oh, well, I was just on my way to your place. And he's like, well, where's your friend? He's like, the hell are you talking about? He's like, well, why the hell would you come here? He's like, well, because I wanted to talk to you man to man about things. And then he pulls out the divorce papers and hands to him. You got to sign your papers. He's like, this is all what it's about. Money, divorce, signing these papers. He's like, no, this is about getting you out of my life and me out of your life and moving on with things. They're completely talking about two different things. And all of a sudden, that's when he starts implying that Shooter was involved to Ted. And Ted's like, what the hell are you talking about? And then all of a sudden he shoves him. And then he's like, I had to bury my dog, mister. And, he starts telling him, your little friend started this shit. I'm going to finish it. So go back and tell that to your filthy little friend. And then he puts his fingers in his eyes. And as Ted tries to take a swing at him, he breaks his fingers and shit, tapping onto his window. And he's like, oh, bummer, Ted. And then he finally goes home. And, he's just unwinding and shit. He takes the hat out of the bag, throws it on top of his phone. And what I thought was cool about this film, there's a lot of little winks to various authors and writers and stuff like that. And as he's in the house, after he throws the hat on the phone rings. He takes off the hat, and then all of a sudden he picks it up, and then it ends up being John. And, John Shooter tells him, hey, go at that part where we met the first time, and you'll see what I mean. So, he starts flipping out. He hangs up the phone. He starts running down the trail, and he sees that it's Tom Greenleaf's truck. And, as he gets closer to Tom Greenleaf's truck, he sees that inside Tom Greenleaf is driving and Ken Kirsch is in the back and they're both dead. And he starts flipping the fuck out. And he passes out. And as he passed out, he passed out for a couple hours. He barely wakes up. And all of a sudden you hear John Shooter's voice and he's like, 2:15. And he goes, he starts getting up and starts flipping the fuck out. And he goes, you were sleeping for so dang long, I was going to pin a note on your head. And then he's telling him, what the hell do you want from me? I set you up to those two guys like you wouldn't even know. You got this situation here to take care of. And he's like, I have the magazine. I have the goddamn magazine with the story. And he's like, there can't be any story. Not with my story in it. And, they had the dialogue where they're bickering. And so that's when he basically says, get this story and I'll meet you later. And it was pretty much like, then what happens if I prove you wrong? He's like, well, then I'm crazy and then they'll arrest me and I'll turn myself in, But I know how to take care and protect my own. And, if you screw me over, I will burn your life and everything in it like a cane field in a high wind. And then, the way that he ended the conversation, he turns around and he goes, listen, you got my hat. I want it back, one way or the other. And then he walks off. So now Mort has to take care of disposing these dead bodies. And so what he does, he drives the truck all the way towards this cliff and he shifts it into neutral and he's pushing it. He gets his watch stuck, on the transmission. And, as he gets closer and closer towards the cliff, he just rips it out and his watch pops off. So, Kirsch and Tom Greenleaf, they're dead. They're in this car. They go over the cliff and underwater. And when that happens, he's just looking around like, oh shit, what did I do? Then it shows he finally gets home, and as he gets home, his phone rings again. And he picks it up, thinking that it's John Shooter. Ends up being his wife, Amy, and she's crying on the phone, and they start talking about, like, what would things be if it worked out, Would things be different if I, would have kept the baby? It kind of dives into the relationship, that they try to have a baby, it didn't work out. And then they start talking, and she's like, well, I'm worried about you, and I just wanted to see how you were doing. And, they kind of actually had a real conversation. And then, he's basically asking her, like, okay, what was the reason why you called? And she goes, you still haven't signed the divorce papers. And he's like, oh my God. And he's like, that's all it's about. He goes, I actually thought you cared. And she goes, I do care. It's my fault. 6 months ago, you still sounded the same way as you did. And then, the best line of this whole film, he screams at the top of his lungs, well, then you should have fucked him then. And then slams the phone. And then she gets all pissed off. And so she finally just says, fuck it. So she gets her coat on, she gets all the papers, her shoes on, And then eventually she's like, I'm done with this shit. And she tells Ted, I'm going to go handle it. You stay here. He's just going to go crazy if you go. So I'm going to go handle it. So she ends up leaving from Ted's place to go see Mort. And as that's going on, Mort, he slammed the phone and he starts, going into town. He goes into the post office. And eventually once he goes in there, he starts talking to the girl and says, hey, did UPS drop off something for me? She gives him a package and he's like, oh, okay, thanks. And she says something and then he thinks he hears something else. And then he's like, what? It was along the lines where, oh, I saw what you did. And he turned around and he's like, what? And she said, well, they would kill me, if you did. And they were talking about a conversation where she's like, oh yeah, don't tell the post office we mess with UPS and stuff. He's like, yeah, okay, I gotta go. And she's like, get some rest. And, it showed that she had a thing for him. She's like, oh, cute. He gets to his car. He tries opening the package and he sees the sheriff, and the sheriff is trying to talk to him. He's like, hey, you got a minute? He's like, no, not really, but I'll call you later. He's like, okay. And he's like, I'm gonna call you on the phone. So now it builds up to this whole suspense of what the ending of the film could be. It shows that Mort, he finally gets home. He tries to open the package and he's like, what the hell? Because the package is already open. Takes out the magazine, sees where Secret Window's at. And he looks and it goes from like 83 to 99. And he's like, what the hell, 83, 99? And then, he bends the book up and he sees that it's cut in the middle, like at the bind. And he thinks to himself, you son of a bitch, you cut it out. Cut it out right out of the magazine. And then all of a sudden you hear him starting to talk to himself. Well, how did he do that? I don't know. And he goes, well, how the hell can he cut it out? I don't know. Just going back and forth with himself like that. And then he walks in. And when he's at home, he decides to put the magazine down and everything like that. And then he looks at John Shooter's hat. And then he decides, okay, he puts it on and he's looking through the mirror. As he's looking in the mirror, he starts talking to himself again. And, he asks himself, like, why'd you put it on? I don't know. I wanted to try it on. And then, his voice starts going crazy on himself. Like, maybe he wants you. And then he's like, maybe he wants me to what? Get confused.
Get confused.
He goes, oh, I'm already confused, Pilgrim. Plenty confused. And then it actually shows, himself talking to himself, like in various different forms. Like, hey, John Shooter, don't you think there's something wrong with that? And he goes, leave me alone. And he's like, I don't have time for this bullshit. And, eventually his mind is getting to him saying, like, you got to turn yourself into the sheriff before you start killing anybody. And he goes, I didn't kill anybody. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And then this is where the whole twist comes in, where his whole self is telling him, like, hey, it's all you. It's all in your head. And, eventually they're telling him, you are John Shooter. And he's like, leave me alone. He picks up an ashtray, throws it at the wall. And he starts seeing this crack that goes all the way up throughout his whole house. And, that signifies that he's eventually cracked. And as he's, thinking about things, all of a sudden he starts hearing John Shooter's voice. And he's like, you're not real. He goes, me, I am real. I exist because of you. And the whole twist was that John Shooter was in his mind the whole time. It was that's the twist. It was like, what the fuck? Like, how did all this play out? And so John Shooter explains. He goes, you gave me my name. And, I did everything you wanted me to do. And, everything that you couldn't stomach, I took care of. And then it shows how he's looking down and he's seeing all the flashbacks of how he got the hat. And, he got the hat back in 1997, like out in a farm where they were doing a yard sale. And he was teasing his wife, oh, yeah, I'm a dairy farm from Mississippi, And then it starts showing how he killed Tom Greenleaf and he killed Kirsch. And how he burned down his own house and everything like that. And, it's a really good twist where, his own inner demon gets the best of him. And then eventually he snaps. And then, he tells him, he goes, you know what you need to do, right? And then he hands him the hat. And then that's when Amy pulls up to his house. As Amy pulls up, she starts freaking out because she sees all these papers and stuff floating all around. She's, calling for Mort and everything. She gets in the house. And now what's kind of crazy is that you're actually seeing the whole movie on the outside perspective of Mort. And you see that Mort's house is just fucking destroyed. Everything's tilted over. Lamps are all broken and shit. He's drinking a bottle of Jack. And, she starts seeing that there's Shooter written all over his whole house. So she goes up the stairs and she starts seeing everything, starts moving shit around on his desk, and it says Shooter, Shooter, Shooter. And then, he's behind the door, closes it, and it says shoot her. That's the whole thing with John Shooter, as it's a play on the word shooter, kind of like Red Rum, which also was a Stephen King reference, which I thought was like, oh shit, there's all these Stephen King references. Even the mirror where he was talking to himself, that was a wink to Dolores Claiborne. And so anyways, you know, she starts freaking out, and then she was like, man, where the hell did you get that hat, you know, out of the attic? And, you know, he has a different voice, different demeanor, because now he's John Shooter. And that's when he tells her, you know, it's mine. It was never anybody else's. And she goes, why are you talking like that? I've always talked like this here. And, you know, he was actually going to try and kill her. And, you know, that's when he, you know, pulls her hair and everything. She runs out. And as he runs after her, you know, she kicks him in the face. He gets up and he puts the hat on. She gets in her car. She can't start her car because it's a fucking Saab. And Saab cars, they had this weird ignition where you had to put it like on the side in the center console, turn it, and it was a stick. So she was like freaking out. So she's like trying to do it, and she didn't realize she had the emergency brake on. And as, you know, Mort comes out, he sees the rock that was left at his front door, uses the rock to break the window, pulls Amy out, and they, you know, he drags her in the house. They start bickering and everything, and he eventually stabs her in the leg with scissors, and then she kicks him again in the face. And as she's trying to run out, you know, he kicks her, and she falls out the door and hits her head. And, you know, he's basically talking to her and saying, well, I'm sorry there, little missus, but this is all Mr. Rainey's idea. And she's trying to tell him, but you are more Rainey. You are. And he goes, I got a special place for you.
I got it all.
And, you know, he's living off the story of Secret Window. And as that's going on, it showed earlier in the scene that Ted, he was just getting anxious, so he said, fuck it. Ted had left, and he had went there. And Ted, when he had came up, you know, she's starting to scream, Ted, no! Ted, no! And he hides on the side, so he runs through the house and everything. Then all of a sudden he gets the shovel and fucking clocks him and, you know, knocks him the fuck out. And, you know, he falls over and she's screaming. And as he's knocked out, like twitching, you know, he uses the shovel and hits him again and kills him. Eventually he comes up to her and, you know, he tells her the whole original ending that John Shooter had planned. You know I could do it, Todd Downey said, helping himself to an ear of corn from the steaming bowl. I'm sure that in time her death will be a mystery. Even to me. And you would think that'd be a great ending, but then it gets even better. It shows later on, you know, it doesn't imply how long it is. It's been obviously a couple weeks, and it shows that he's all cleaned up. He has braces now because she fucked up his teeth. He goes in the store, and everybody in the store is looking at him all weird. He sees a girl from the post office, and he's trying to talk to her, trying to flirt, trying to ask her out on a date. And, she, you know, she rushes out and everything. She was done with him. And, you know, he comes up with salt, butter, and, you know, your basic stuff, right? And eventually it shows that, you know, he's back at home and he's working on a new story. The sheriff comes, you know, knocking on the door, and he's like, okay, I'm going to come in because the door's open. So the sheriff walks in, and he's looking around. He sees there's all this fucking corn growing everywhere, right? And he sees that there's this gym set and everything, these free weights. And then, you know, he's looking for him, Mr. Rainey, Mr. Rainey. So he comes up, and, you know, they start talking. And he tells him, well, we both know what you did. I just don't have enough evidence to put you away. And, you know, don't come into town anymore because it makes people uncomfortable. You can do your shopping in the next town over. And, you know, that's when Mort looks at him. He goes, okay, I understand. And then that's when he tells him about the ending. He goes, you know, the ending is the most important part of the story. And it makes up everything for it. And this one has a good ending. And the sheriff is looking at him like, what the fuck is he talking about? And, you know, he puts on his headphones. He snaps his jaw, because you could tell with him snapping his jaw, that's a John Shooter trait. And as that's going on, then it shows that it's zooming out the window and into the secret garden that's all corn. And then it goes down to the ground. And then it shows where, you know, he's reciting the same quote, I know I could do it, Todd Downey said. I'm sure that in time her death will be a mystery, even to me. And then all of a sudden it shows corn, and then he bites into it, and it's implied that, you know, he got away with killing them, and he buried their bodies and, you know, grew corn over it. Which I thought, oh shit, so he got away. And, you know, that ends up being the end of the movie. And if you think about it, this was a really great fucking film. I mean, you know, it's not, I wouldn't classify this film as horror. I would classify this as a terror suspense film, because the whole time, you know, this one character is fucking with him, and then the twist at the end is that it was his own inner demon with it. And, you know, I can relate a lot to this film because of the fact that, you know, if you've ever been in a situation where, you know, you've been with someone or you've been married for a long time and it have it end very similar fashion like to how Secret Window is, It's not a good feeling. And the fact that, you know, he was isolated himself, and, you know, he just kind of didn't know how to deal with things. And, you know, it's one of those films that really kind of gets to me, because the thing that makes this film scary is the fact that it's all about mental horror. You know, it's all about, you know, your mentality. You know, all the scary stuff that goes into your head and it lets loose and runs wild. And that's what makes this film scary. The differences between this film and the book, though, the beginning where he's at the hotel, that wasn't in the book. They actually added that in, so, you know, it's better storytelling for the movie and everything like that. The differences were just more or less like the names of the titles of the book. You know, one or two scenes here and there, I mean, they were added in versus from the book. But, I mean, this was one of those Stephen King books that was closely related to the film. Actually, one of the only ones I think it's closely related to the book and the film. Were like neck and neck to each other. But one of the best things that I really enjoyed about this film is that there was so many different winks to Stephen King on this. In the book, they said that Amy and Mort, their original hometown, was Derry. And I thought, oh shit, that would have been badass if they actually did that. But, you know, obviously they wanted to have a little different twist to it. They want to kind of break away so that way they attract people to see this film. So there were some things that they cut out. But this whole film had a lot of different winks to what Stephen King liked and various different authors. Even some of the quotes. The quote where he says, "This is not my beautiful wife. This is not my beautiful home anymore." That was a quote from a famous book. I forgot which book it is, but I know it was from a famous book. Then you had, you know, the scene where he throws John Shooter's hat on the phone. You see a book from Hunter S. Thompson, and it was The Rum Diaries. Later on, Johnny Depp would go and do the Rum Diaries movie because he was a fan of the book. And I thought it was really cool. There was a lot of little winks here and there that really made this film pop out. And, you know, for what it was, they really did try pushing this film so it wasn't like PG, it wasn't like a TV-made film. And, you know, a lot of the critics really did like this film. The only complaint is that a lot of people would think the story is meant for like a novella. That's what a lot of people would classify this book. It's not suspense thriller. The book is actually listed as a novella. And, you know, what's crazy about it is that the only thing that the critics got on is that they said this would have been a perfect TV-made movie, but since they made it as a movie, they wanted to do something a little bit more to it. As far as like all the other actors in this film, the main one obviously was Johnny Depp, and they did this film in between, you know, the first Pirates of the Caribbean and the second one. And, you know, they definitely were pushing off that Johnny Depp craze at that time. You know, because when that film came out, everybody was all about Johnny Depp. And, you know, it came out at the right time because it was a really good film. But the reason why people forget about it is because obviously, you know, there's not that many Stephen King films that come out, you know, very often now, you know, in the 2000s, well, late 2000s now, 2020, this decade. But at the time in 2004, you know, you got to think this film is 16 years old and it still holds up today for what it is. And I advise, you know, if you guys never seen this film, go check it out. It's a really good film. But for what Secret Window was, you know, it's a really good film. I enjoy the hell out of it. It's still one of my favorites. And, you know, if I had to classify a top 5 favorite of Stephen King films, definitely this would be in the top 5. Not so much for top 3 because there's so many other films that, you know, were based off Stephen King books, but definitely this film is one of my top 5. But thank you all for joining me for episode 58 on Secret Window, and I'll catch you all next time, as always.